Hello, my name is Stephanie Toddy, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today on putting data to work, incorporating technology into curriculum review, presented by Mr. Eric Ermie, Director of Client Solutions here at ExamSoft, and formerly Program Manager for Assessment and Evaluation at the Ohio State University College of Medicine. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. Eric, if you could go ahead and go to the next slide for me. If you have any specific questions, we encourage everyone to type them through the questions feature of the GoToWebinar control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. We will have a chance to answer all questions at the conclusion of the webinar. Also, at the conclusion, you should have a quick survey pop up for you. We encourage everyone to fill the survey out if possible so that we can continue to provide relevant content at all of our presentations. About 5 questions. It shouldn't take you but a couple of minutes. Also, as a heads up, all attendees and registrants for the webinar will receive a link to the recording of the webinar by the end of the week, as well as a copy of the presentation deck. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Eric. Thank you so much for attending, and please enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Stephanie. Like Stephanie said, I'm Eric. I'm the Director of Client Solutions, and I appreciate you taking some time out of your day today to join us to go through this. I personally think that this is a really important topic and really relevant topic because so many schools are going through curricular review, and finding different ways we can help with that process is, I think, an important thing because there's so many different outcomes that can be affected, and we want to be able to help schools along the way as they go through this long and difficult process to really make it the most effective process possible. There's a lot of different aspects when you do curricular change, and there's a lot of ways that data, whether it's student scores, category data, question data, that can help with this process. And if there's one common thread amongst the many ways that you can change curriculums and the ways we can help you with your curricular change, it's that we can help you quantify and measure change. Positively or negatively, we can give you the power to compare and analyze trends or monitor performance for real-time course corrections. So we're going to run through a couple of things today. Forces behind the change, what are they? Why is all this happening, and why is it happening across the board, whether it's nursing or medical or undergrad? There are forces behind curricular change everywhere right now. What are some of those? What are the most common themes of curricular redesign or revision, the things we're seeing the most frequently that most schools are doing or that are most frequently used as ways of reforming curriculum? And then what we can do to help. Whether you're using us now or you're not using us now, there's a lot of things we can do to help, and we'll break those down for you depending on which one of those 2 groups you're a part of. And then also, I lived this. So I went through a curricular reform. I was part of the implementation committee. I was in charge of executing the entire assessment and evaluation piece amongst a group of a team that I was a part of once the curriculum was actually put in place. So I'm going to give you some examples of how I was able to do this and actually use some data, and give you a couple of our moments where we just dodged a bullet, or things came out the way we wanted, and some anecdotes and some stories like that along the way. And then at the end, we'll have some questions. So to get started, why change? There's pressure from accreditation bodies, and that's always going to spur change no matter how you want to slice it, whether you think it's needed or not. If the accreditation bodies are pushing for it, it's going to happen. But besides the accreditation bodies, just best practices are changing so fast. The best way to educate students is changing rapidly. 5 years ago to now is not that long when you think about it in academia, but yet the best ways to educate students are completely different now than they were 5 years ago. And they're definitely different now than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And sometimes it's been that long since we revised the curriculum. So you know what? These best practices for educating our students are changing. Now what do we do? And that's where some of the pressure from change can come from as well. Additionally, board exams. A lot of different programs have a board exam at the end of it that students have to pass, and passing criteria is increasing. It's becoming more stringent. It's becoming more comprehensive. And so we've got to adapt to meet those needs and make sure we're preparing our students as best we possibly can for board exams. Student expectations are changing. They've always been high, and they're getting higher and higher and higher and higher. And at this point, things like the delivery methods, contents, the technologies available, all those different things, the students' expectations are just ratcheted up on. You know, the amount of access they have to students or to staff and faculty, those expectations are ramping up. So we have to meet the expectations of our students because in today's day and age where tuition dollars are tight, we want students to come to our institution, and whatever your institution is, your goal is to bring in the best, and you've got to try and meet their expectations if you're going to do that. And then let's face it, everybody else is doing it. Even if you love your curriculum and you think everything is fine and you're getting great results, everyone else is doing it. You can't be the only one who's not doing it. That's the world of academia today. So sometimes it's just a matter of being forced that direction by everybody else as well. So let's take a look at some of the common themes. And I'm going to list out these common themes, and I'm going to go through each one of them and give you some challenge areas that I'm familiar with each of them and some ways that I think we can help with those challenges. Individual courses by content or subject area being converted into integrated courses. It's really been a strong movement over the last, I'd say, 10 or 15 years even, in areas like medicine and some of the others, but it's branching out into lots of areas that it is better, it is more educationally sound to teach things around content appropriate or context appropriate things, that no longer having a biochemistry course, a pathology course, a physiology course, an anatomy course, all these different things, teaching their things in silos and expecting your students to be able to pull that together and use it relevantly around medicine or around you know, patient care or whatever it might be. The ability to do that is a little tough when you're teaching it all separate, and the best practice seems to really be going towards teaching all those things together. And so there's some challenges and some areas we can help that come along with that when you're integrating a bunch of different things into one course, or maybe you're integrating into case-based. A lot of nursing schools are going case-based because there's just so many different components to teach, but it's a lot easier to teach them around the cases like they're going to see when they're out in the practice. Converting to competency-based, now that can be a part of integrating courses, but it can also be just a separate thing. And going to competency-based curriculum and making sure your students are meeting minimum competencies and that you're able to track those competencies across time, that is something that a lot of different schools are going to. And that I know some different groups like the LCME and the AAMC are very much pushing towards competency-based things. That's something they're interested in, and we're seeing it all the way down to the undergraduate level as well. The competency-based curriculum and making sure that students aren't walking out until they've met these minimum competencies is a big push right now. One of the other common things is realigning the curriculum and content to better reflect board exam requirements. Like I was saying before, you want to make sure that your students are the most prepared that they can possibly be for the scores. You want high board scores. You want no failures. You want all these things. And your students want to make sure that you can show them that the students who went through your program before them accomplished those things. That incoming students want to see that the students before them performed well when it comes to those areas. And so it's important to realign your curriculums to make sure that they match those sorts of things. And that's a common theme right now, especially for nursing. Again, I'm harping on that one because there's a lot of different reform going on there. Also, these last two, they're a little bit involved with all of these. I would say that I very rarely see one of the above three without the bottom two, but changes in delivery of the curriculum to integrate new forms of teaching and technology and the reordering of content, sometimes they're done independently, but most of the time they're done in conjunction with all these different things. That as you're going to integrated courses, you're going to have to reorder your content and try and put it together into a flow. And that as you're going through any sort of curricular revision, whether it's integrating or competency-based or realigning to meet the boards, that you're going to have to integrate new forms of teaching and technology, because that's just to keep up with education in today's day and age. That's something that a lot of schools are having to do, whether it's iPads or podcast technology, lecture capture technology, articulate modules, e-learning modules, things along those lines. All of those things can become part of any of these processes. And some schools are just going through and revamping their teaching and technology, even though they're keeping the rest of it the same. So these are the most common things that we're seeing. I would say pretty much every single part of this went into our curricular redesign that I went through. In fact, you know, looking at the list, every single part of it was part of our process as we went through things. And so sometimes now you're not dealing with one of these things, you're dealing with all of them. So one of the things to go along these lines that I think is really important is to know your intentions. And before you get too far into this, as far as actually executing your new curriculum, look back at what your intentions were. Were there specific outcomes that you wanted when you instituted this change? What was the impetus behind it? Why were you doing this? Because those things are really, really important. And sometimes it's really easy to lose sight of them. And I know for us, we started 4 years before our curriculum actually started was when the design process started. So we had a year of design, then we had a few years of implementation and piloting, and then finally we went to a full-blown release. Well, by the time we got to full-blown release, trying to remember the intentions behind things from those very first design meetings, where when we made a decision about how things were going to go, remembering why we made that decision and making sure that we implemented it and executed it in a way that was in line with those things. But then also for trying to figure out whether we were successful, you have to know your intentions to be able to guide and judge whether or not you're being successful. The other part of that is, do you have a baseline? So this is where a couple things will separate for people who are currently clients of ours versus not clients of ours. But having a baseline is really important. If you can have historical data and statistics and category breakdowns so that you know how your students are performing on different learning objectives and subjects and topics and all these different things, then you've got a great baseline that you can compare to in the future. Now, if you don't have any of those things, if you haven't been using our system and you don't have all that historical data saved up, you're going to have to measure versus your intention. And that can still give you very, very helpful information and great results as far as being able to know early on whether or not you're as successful as you'd like to be. But either way, you have to have some sort of baseline, whether that baseline is a set of data or whether that baseline is your intentions and making sure you accomplish those intentions. Either way, a baseline is a really vital part to whether or not you're going to be able to accurately and effectively measure whether or not your curriculum is doing what you wanted it to do. So where do we fit in? Let's start going through. Let's take a look at some of these most common forms of curricular change. First of all, becoming integrated. So what are the challenges? Well, how are my students doing in a certain subject? I used to have an anatomy score. I used to have a physiology score. I used to have a pathology score. But now I have no idea what they're doing in those things because I have a score for the entire block of the curriculum, or I have a score, during case-based learning, and I have a score for all the assessments related to how they did on these cases. But intertwined in all there's threads, there's subject areas and topics and competencies that are threaded through there that are all integrated together. But when they're all integrated together, while that may enhance the learning, it does make it harder to diagnose your curriculum and diagnose your students and say, is there an area they're struggling with, or is there an area that they're maybe doing exceptional in? The other thing is, am I distributing my assessment across all the integrated components the way I wanted to, the way I really intended to do this? Sometimes things can get lost along the way. So you've integrated, great, that's awesome. And now you've got all these things set up, and your faculty are working together, and you've managed to come up with cases that intertwine all the different threads you want, or you've managed to base your curriculum around these sorts of things in the way you intended to. But when you came to assessing all of that, did you forget biochemistry? Did you forget pathology? Did you forget, some procedural skill or something like that? Are you assessing everything across those areas the way you intended? How do you know whether or not one thing is dominating your assessments versus others that still need to be assessed just as equally? The other thing is, do you need to tweak distribution of instruction time? That's a challenge when you integrate, because there's usually a whole different type of delivery to an integrated curriculum than there is to a siloed curriculum. And now instead of students having a certain number of hours in class on each topic every single day, instead they get it all together. But you still have to take a look at that distribution of time, and if students are struggling in a certain area, maybe devote more time to it. If maybe something didn't get any time allocated to it at all, how are you going to know those sorts of things? And if you do know that you need to tweak, how do you know what to tweak? Also, sample size. So let's say that you can get past some of these things and that you're able to parse out your student performance in each of the integrated subject areas. Well, the N might be too small to draw any conclusions. You're used to having a 100-question anatomy exam. If somebody got a 60% on that, you knew they were struggling. If somebody got 100% on that, you knew they were doing really, really well. But maybe there's only 5 anatomy questions per block now, and you got 20 blocks. Well, 5 questions and I got a 60%, does that really mean anything? Probably not. If 5 questions I got 100%, does that mean I'm great in anatomy? Probably not. So now the sample sizes are a little bit too small to draw conclusions. How do I know if this is working? So what can we do to help? You can, within our system, link the questions with specific subject areas to get reports on student performance. So in addition to getting, okay, the students got an 85%, maybe that was the class average, and each individual student got whatever they got, but you can also see but within that, a sub-score, and those sub-scores are category performance. If you categorize all your questions by whether these 5 are pathology and these 5 are anatomy and these 10 are physiology and whatever, you can then see a report that will show you how the students are doing in each of those areas. And so now, even though you're integrated, which is the best way to teach it, which is why you went to that in the first place, you're still able to get individual sections of scores that help you know what, the class got an 85, but the entire class bombed a particular subject area integrated within all of this. You don't lose that information. You don't lose that guidance from the data because, if everybody had bombed the biochemistry course back when you were course-based, you knew you had a problem there and you knew what you had to do to fix it. But if they're struggling with a thread inside of one of these integrated curriculums, it's a little bit harder to diagnose unless you've got this category data. And that's a great thing that can help you along the way when you're putting in a new curriculum when it comes to these things. Now, using exam blueprinting can help you in a couple of different ways. One of the things, besides their performance on all these things, is are they balanced and is something missing? Did I cover all the areas that I was supposed to, that are supposed to be integrated? Did I cover them all together? And did I cover them the way I wanted to? Are they balanced? Do I have 40 pathology questions and 2 anatomy? Whatever it might be. Well, you can use the blueprinting to take a look and say, all right, here's how many categories are represented in this exam. Here's how frequently each one of those categories is represented within the exam. Hey, you know what? I'm really unbalanced in this direction. I'm going to fix it. Or I don't see, biochemistry on the list at all. I need to add that in. Whatever it might be, the exam blueprinting tool can let you figure that out before you give the exam to the students and they come back to you and they say, hey, why did we bother to learn this week of material that you didn't even put on the exam? The blueprinting will help you get in front of that. Aggregate performance of the class is a really powerful tool for that tweaking of instructional time that I was talking about. So if you can take a look at those performances in each individual subject area or even on each individual learning objective, you can then take a look and say, all right, you know what, everybody's doing great on this, but they're really struggling on this other area over here. I'm going to take a couple of days away from these other subjects. I'm going to put in a review session about this difficult one, plus an extra day of lecture and maybe a couple of e-learning modules to help further understanding of it. And now you're making some targeted improvements to your curriculum on the fly, just in time, as you need them to make sure that things come out in your new curriculum the way you want them to. The other thing is that end problem I was talking about. Longitudinal analysis will help you solve that. We have the ability to go through the different exams and take a look at the categories that are used. And if you're using the same categories in multiple exams, we can analyze those across the exams for you and across time. So let's say your integrated curriculum has, the examples I keep using, pathology, physiology, anatomy, and there's 5 to 10 questions in every exam about each of those things. Well, sure, 1 or 2 exams isn't going to mean much, but if you can longitudinally analyze those categories, and after 5 or 6 or 7 exams, you've got 60 questions in each of those categories. Now all of a sudden the data you're getting is much more important. It's much more valuable. It's something you can draw some conclusions off of, whereas the other data isn't something you can draw some conclusions off of. So those are just a few of the ways that if you're going integrated, that we can really kind of help you on the fly, make sure things are going to be the way you wanted them to, make tweaks to adjust when things aren't working. So with that, I'm going to stop for a second. I'm going to give you just a little bit of I said I'd give some anecdotes along the way from my experience in this. One of the things that I learned going through this process was the best laid plans are just that. They are plans. And we had to really kind of swallow our pride at a couple of points and say, hey, you know what? We thought this was great. We had meeting upon meeting upon meeting about it. We did focus groups. We consulted students. We consulted faculty. We did all these great things, and it didn't work at all. It was just, you know what? It just didn't work out the way we wanted it to. You can try and keep forcing that into place and keep running into the same difficulties, or the ability to use data to be agile in how you're handling the implementation of your curriculum can help you with that problem. And that you've got this data, you know how to use it, and you're gonna take it for what it's worth and say, okay, you know what, this isn't working. We thought it would work. Let's tweak it. Let's see if we can change it a little bit to make it more effective. And that's just something that I think will make the process a lot easier for you along the way if you kind of keep that in mind as you're going through. It's hard to take 4 years of work and just throw it away in a second, but at the same time, certain ideas are going to just be better off in thought than in practice. So going competency-based. there's some challenges with going competency-based, and I think I'm a big fan of competency-based curriculum, actually, personally, but there's some challenges that are associated with that, and there's some things we can do to help. Some of those challenges are the ability to measure achievement across time. The key to competency-based is that you've set up these competencies, and you have certain things that you want your students to be competent in. And they have until graduation or until milestones that you've set within your curriculum to get competent in those areas. Well, in order to make sure that your students are on the right trajectory and that they're on pace to get to the level of competency that you require, you've got to be able to measure their achievement across time and be able to make sure that as they go, they're contributing towards that, the buildup they need in that competency to reach that minimum competency level. Also, there's multi-competency assessment, and it's a lot easier when you just have a score, an assessment and a score. You got some quizzes, you got some exams, you got some papers, and there's a score for all of them. But with competency-based, each part of one of those assessments might go towards a different competency. And so you might have an exam that covers 3 competencies. And in multi-competency assessment, you need to make sure that when the students are being judged on whether or not they're meeting minimum competency, that only things about that competency are contributing to their achievement in it. So it's not fair necessarily to take all 100 questions of the exam and count that towards their achievement in competency A, because maybe only 30 of those questions were actually about competency A. So you're going to need the ability to parse those things out. Competency-based remediation is also a struggle. Maybe I got an 80% on my exam, but again, it's an exam that had 3 different competencies in it, and maybe on one of those particular competencies, I completely and totally bombed. But you need to know which one that is. You need to know that that happened. Not that I got an 80, but you need to know that one of those competencies was a 40, but I compensated for it by doing really well on the other ones. And then you need to be able to remediate me based on that. And so we can give you some tools for doing that. I'll show you those in a second. And then the last thing is that the variety of assessment types necessary. When you're doing a competency-based curriculum, sometimes papers and projects and regular quizzes and exams aren't going to cut it. You're going to need to do direct observations of competence. You're going to need to do clinicals. You're going to need to do OSCEs. You're going to need to assess their professionalism, their interpersonal communication skills, their patient care skills, any of these things. There's a multitude of things that can be competencies, but you're going to need to be able to assess them differently as well, because some of those other competencies don't necessarily lend themselves to being scored or assessed via a regular exam. And so one of the things, as we go forward here, I'll show you some different options that we can provide to you to help you with that problem, because sometimes it's hard to get the data you need out of other types of assessments the way you do a multiple choice exam, because the multiple choice exam gives you some fairly cut and dry, simple data that you can use versus other assessments might not. So how can we help? So tagging the competencies to the questions with categories. You're going to see that to be a common thread as I go through all these different things, that the categories are going to be probably one of the most popular and powerful ways that you can check things within your curriculum and help solve some of these problems. And it might be different implementations of using categories depending on the type of curriculum, but the categories are still going to be the key. So tag those competencies to questions. So now you're going to get a competency subscore from each one of your assessments. So you'll see how the students did in each competency, and then you can attribute only the portion of the exam that was about that competency to their overall grade in that competency, to make sure that you're keeping that clean, that a student is only being judged in their minimum competence on a certain competency by the things that actually were assessed by that. Another thing you can do is use those same subscores I'm talking about to look at remediation. You can take a look at them in the areas that are below whatever threshold you set. We always use 70%, but you can use whatever you want. Whatever threshold you set, if a student's below that in one of the competencies, you'll be able to see that in the competency subscores, and then you can choose to have them remediate just that competency, instead of having them remediate an entire exam that maybe they got, like I said, an 80% on, but maybe that 80%, the 20% they missed was mainly in one competency, so they still do have an area of remediation that they need to take care of. Also, we have a rubrics platform. And so a moment ago when I was talking about different types of assessment and the ability to assess other competencies better than with other forms of assessment that aren't multiple choice, that's where rubrics comes in. And so we have a rubric platform that allows you to set up rubrics and tag competencies, tag learning objectives, tag anything you want to these rubrics just like you do your multiple choice questions. So each row of a rubric, which assesses a different thing about the student, would have a competency or category tag to it so that you can get the exact same data that you're getting from a multiple choice exam. You can get the same subscores about their competency performance. Maybe a couple of the points on the rubric are about patient care, and a couple of them are about professionalism, a couple of them are about patient safety, and maybe those are 3 competencies of yours. You can still get subscores in the same form as you get the data from an exam that covers those 3 things, and then you can put them together as well. So utilizing our rubrics tool will enable you to assess in multiple different settings and multiple different types of assessment that you wouldn't have been able to assess before, and now you've got all that information and data to put back into your curriculum and say, okay, are our students achieving the way we need them to? Are we getting the type of feedback we need to about our students to make sure that they're meeting the trajectory they need to hit minimum competence before graduation? The other thing is longitudinal analysis, that you can track that competency performance across time. And because most competencies don't have to be met until graduation, even if they do have milestones along the way, this is a great way to keep track of that trajectory I keep talking about and looking at the student performance over time to make sure that they are doing the things you need them to do, they're achieving to the levels you need them to achieve. And the other part of that longitudinal analysis, in addition to tracking those competencies across time, it enables you to easily combine the data from a regular exam and a rubrics exam. And so you can combine those 2 things into one score that contributes towards the competency instead of having to keep it all separate. So the next one is reflecting board and licensure exams and changing your curriculum to meet those things. And that's a really important thing to students. I'd say it's very important to faculty and administration, but it's really important to students because they want to know that at the end of this curriculum they're going to do well on the boards. And some of the challenges when you try to meet your curriculum to the board's needs is making sure that your assessment has the right types of questions and styles of questions, making sure your assessment internally is matching up with that, making sure that your content is mapped to what is covered. Is you're mapping your content to your internal assessments and then mapping your internal assessments to what's covered in the boards to make sure that you're hitting the areas the students need you to hit. And then providing feedback that assists students with board preparation. I'll tell you a little story here. As we go into this next slide about what we can do, one of the things that we can do is provide, and I'm going to skip down to the bottom point here, but we can provide a lot of reports and useful data to your students to help them monitor their performance and use it to help them study for the boards. We used to give all kinds of great category data and feedback to our students before they would go into their board prep time so they could use it to make specific decisions. I'm great in these 3 categories. I'm not going to study them that much in my board prep. But in these 5 subject areas, I'm really struggling every single time across the whole curriculum. So I'm going to spend some extra time on that. That will not only help your students, or help you as a curriculum by telling your students what they need to do better in, but your students can be better self-directed learners at that point. And your students will be able to take a look at that and make sure that they're performing better and putting that power in their hands. Instead of them feeling 100% reliant on you, they've now got some information, some power to help themselves when it comes to getting ready for the boards. But as far as some of those other problems with getting ready for the boards I was talking about, again, categorization. If you go through and you take a look at your item bank and you categorize it by this is a board style question and this one isn't, or this is a clinical vignette question versus a recall question, or maybe you throw Bloom's taxonomy on all the different questions so you know what level of thinking that you're actually checking their performance on. Any of those things can really help you to make sure that you're lining up with the difficulty and maybe the rigor of the board exam. It gives you some power there to check and make sure that your students are seeing, maybe you can't get to 100% board style questions, but maybe you want to make sure at least it's 50%. Well, if you categorize by whether or not they're board style questions, you'll be able to check that number and make sure that you're giving them the amount of questions and the type that you want them to. Also, does the distribution of your assessments, do they match up with the cognitive levels of the boards? Is the cognitive levels within your exams matching the licensing body's use in the sense that maybe they're going to have 10, 20% knowledge, recall level type questions, and the rest are going to be application, synthesis, analysis, evaluation, and so on? You can kind of take a look at that and internally and say, hey, are we matching up with this or not? So delivery method. Again, this is one of those ones that can be in all of them, that can be by itself. But the changes in delivery method Is the new delivery method effective? If there is an issue, is it with the actual delivery method, or is it this topic in this method? Maybe adding a bunch of podcasts and e-learning modules was a great idea, and it's working wonderfully. But this particular topic or subject maybe just doesn't lend itself to that style of teaching. Or does this style of teaching just not lend itself to effective education? What is it going to be? Also, if you're putting multiple new methods, which ones are most effective? Which ones are least effective? How do you adjust for that on the fly? And then, the overarching theme continuing to be, how do I know this is working? So we can help by letting you compare performance on the items that were covered in a lecture versus an e-learning module versus a podcast, et cetera, to determine whether or not the performance is better or worse than the way it was before. If you've got a bunch of questions in our bank and you've been using them, you have some statistics. You know what those item statistics look like, what percentage of students get it right, what are the discrimination indexes, and all those things. Well, if you change the method of delivery of a piece of content, and then you look at the questions that cover that content and the performance went up, great. If the performance went down, okay, changing the delivery method hurt something. We missed something here. Maybe this wasn't something that we could put into a 15-minute e-learning module. Maybe it really did need a 30-minute lecture the way we used to do it because our students are struggling with this now. So you can compare performance on specific items that were covered in those areas to help yourself figure out what's working and what isn't. You can also map your delivery methods to questions, or you can just take a look at learning objectives. So let's say you do map your delivery methods to questions. You can take a look and see, on a whole, how are your students doing on content that was delivered via podcast versus delivered via lecture versus delivered via reading assignment versus e-learning module. And you can just compare the aggregate data. The other thing you can do is take a look at your learning objectives that students are struggling with. If you tag the questions with learning objectives, you can then map them back to what was used to deliver that learning objective. And so if a couple particular learning objectives are struggling, you can go back and look and say, oh, hey, that was an e-learning module. Let's go take a look at that and let's try and fix that up. The other part of that is being able to diagnose when there's a false positive. Maybe you went and took a look and there was a couple learning objectives that struggled really bad and they were podcasted material and they were only available via podcast. But when you take a look at podcast performance on the whole, you can see that, you know what, on the whole, the students scored 85, 88% on all of the content that was delivered via podcast. So it seems to be working really well, except for these two particular learning objectives that were covered in the podcast, and they only got 40% of those. Well, maybe that was just a bad podcast, or maybe it's a bad e-learning module, or maybe that material doesn't lend itself, like I was saying before. Maybe it just doesn't fit that delivery method very well. It helps you identify what are the false positives and what are the areas you need to go through and tweak in a macro level versus a micro level. Reordering content. Reordering content, just like the new methods of delivery and technology for delivering a curriculum, can be part of all of the rest of them. But you're going to reorder your content if you go from a non-integrated to integrated. You're probably going to have to reorder content to match boards if you're trying to fit new things in or take things out that are irrelevant to the boards in order to focus better on board content. Whatever it might be, some of the challenges are that there's a lot of unintentional consequences. There are landmines. There is a domino effect. And even if you avoid all of the collateral damage, how do you know if anything actually improved? Because the content might have been dependent. You might have always had students doing really, really well in a particular area. But now you've moved that area up and you realize, oh, they were doing well in that because they had these other two things before it, which really helped deepen their understanding. And now those things aren't before it, and the students are really struggling. So we need to add or supplement material, not just move it forward. Or maybe we need to put it back where it was or figure out how we need to redivide this material. That's where that domino effect of those unintentional consequences come in. You might have a particular subject area that you're moving because you want it to be closer to the board so it's fresher in students' mind, or you want to devote some more time to it or get it ingrained into them earlier because it's a particular difficult thing. But you can accidentally cause damage to things that you weren't having problems with when you do this. So how can we help with that? The ability to monitor the performance of related material via category and item performance and make just-in-time changes. That way you can compensate for unintentional effects of moving material and those landmines I was talking about. So if you know, okay, I moved all the immunology up in the curriculum, and that it used to come after X, Y, and Z. Well, you can take a look and say, all right, how did immunology do? Oh, you know what we wanted to happen happened. It got better, but the things that it used to be in front of got worse. All right, well, we need to supplement some material there. We need to review something there. Or maybe I moved some things around and everything worked out great, but now we're finding that the second year material, we're getting some really low scores in a couple of threads that used to be really easy, and it's because they never got the prerequisite information. It got moved so late into the curriculum that their students aren't learning it when they need it in the curriculum, because there's other things that are forcing them to require that material at a sooner time in your curriculum. The other thing is that you can parse out the performance data specific to the changes you made and compare it to the intention. So this one was something that we did. We had an area that was really poor for us on the boards every year, and it was at the end of our first year. We decided to move it to the end of our second year because we wanted the students to have more of the curriculum under their belt before they got to that point, and we also wanted them to be closer to the board, so it's fresher in their mind that they just learned it. And if we moved something like that, that sweeping of a change, we really had one very large intention, and if it didn't get better, then it really defeated the purpose of the whole thing. So that goes back to kind of knowing your intentions and what you were intending when you made the change to know how to react to it. All right, I've been blabbering on and on and on, tons of text and nothing else. Let me show you some images. Let me show you some examples of these things. This is an example of an integrated midterm. It's about 60-some questions, I think. And if you take a look through here, you can see how you can still parse out each individual subject area and see how students are doing. And yeah, these numbers are all pretty low, but when you start analyzing them across time and use that longitudinal analysis, you'll be able to see those numbers grow and really get to a significant N that'll tell you whether or not students are doing well in those areas. And so this allows you to integrate, but still keep some of those threads of data that are really important to you. And this is just for an individual exam. I'll show you the longitudinal one in just a second. This is the student dashboard, and this is a really, really powerful part of this whole thing, is the fact that the students have a live dashboard that will update every time they take an exam. With the category data will update here. So they go take an exam, and 5 more questions in biochemistry, and 10 more in musculoskeletal, and whatever else it might be. Those things are all live updating so that the student can see their progress continue. They can see whether they're trending up, trending down. They can see how they're doing in comparison to the class. And even though they may have gotten a 76 or an 86 or a 96 on the exam, they can still see the breakdown of how they did on each individual exam as well as how they did across all those exams to make sure that in each individual area they're achieving what they need to be achieving. And so this is something, we have some reports about the longitudinal data for the faculty as well, but this one is for the students. It's a live dashboard that they'll have access to 24/7. Now here, there's some things. This is the ability to compare item performance. So if you look here, item number 1 was in our new curriculum. Item number 7 was in our old curriculum. And so we took a look at item number 7. It was a particularly difficult concept. Our top students were getting it pretty well, but only 66% of the class was getting this right. It was something that we wanted to really make a mastery level topic, and so we changed some of the way we delivered that content in our new curriculum. And then you take a look at question number 1 above. That was the exam question, same question, but in our new curriculum exam, and now 98% of the students are getting it right. And so we've actually been able to measurably improve what we were looking to do and make sure that what we did worked for improving student learning on this particular topic. Now, if you look down at number 22 and number 34 there, you'll see a little bit of the opposite. Number 22 is the question in our new curriculum, and number 34 is the question in our old curriculum. We took something that used to be a difficult concept, but 71% of the students were getting it, and it had really good discrimination, and we decided to change the way that we delivered that. And if you look at number 22, it went way down. Less of the top students are now getting it. Only 36% of students overall, and there's a ton of students choosing every single answer choice, and so you can really see they're guessing. They have no idea. And so, whoops, we goofed on this one. The way we were doing it before was a little bit better. We didn't get the intended change. And we could bring this information to that faculty member and say, all right, hey, look, take a look at this. Let's change the way we do that one next year. Let's not do this. Let's try something else with it to try and teach that content in a little bit different way. So I said I'd live this. Let me show you some real examples from my time doing this and some of the things that we look for. Here's where we started. This was a longitudinal analysis at the end of our Med 1, Med 2 program. So it's a 2-year program. This is a class-wide longitudinal analysis from our old curriculum. You can see the number of questions is really built up to be a lot. We got 1,500 recall questions, 265 interpretation questions, and so on. And this is the aggregate class performance represented in that percent correct thing. One of the things that we noticed when we first categorized our items was, wow, we have nearly a 3-to-1 ratio on recall to clinical science vignette questions. That is something that we've got to change. That is not what we intended, especially in an area where with medicine, the board exams are 100% clinical vignette questions. So that is definitely not the ratio we wanted. The other thing was, if you take a look, every single year, and this year was no exception, there was a 2.5 to 3.5% difference in performance between recall and application. And so with that point to us was that we were doing a good job with getting the information to students and having them remember the information, but we wanted them to synthesize it more. We wanted them to be able to integrate that knowledge and use that knowledge better, and we didn't want that disparity in our curriculum. One of the other things we looked at was normal and abnormal processes. Again, a 2-to-1 ratio here, and that should really be an equal ratio, and a 3 to 3.5% every single year gap in performance there. These were intentional things that we set out to try and change when we went into the design of our new curriculum. So where are we now? Well, a couple of things. What I didn't mention before is that in addition to going integrated, in addition to picking out some of those things on that previous report that we wanted to fix, we also went competency-based. So from that very first report where you just saw 1,500 recall questions and 400 vignettes and so on, and that was really the only measures of student performance, we now have this. This is a competency breakdown where each student's assessments are parsed out into which part of that assessment applies to which competency, and those scores are tabulated as such. And so some things the students either just meet or don't meet the competency, but other times there's actual scores that contribute towards whether or not they meet or don't meet that competency, and we track this over time, and we're able to give feedback to our students. And so we went to a competency-based curriculum, but at the same time, we still wanted to make sure that our assessment was where we needed it to be, and that as we integrated things, it worked well, and that we made the correct targeted corrections I was talking about. So if you look here, this is only partway through Med 1 because it's a brand new process and we haven't been at it long enough to have a ton of data, but the ratio, instead of 3-to-1, it's a little bit closer. It's better than what we want it to be, or it's better than what it was, I should say. It's still not quite what we want it to be. But one of the nice things, and the things that made us do a little happy dance outside my office one day, was take a look at their performance on recall, 80.33, and take a look at the performance on clinical science vignettes, 80.17. That's nearly identical. And to eliminate that gap is really, really something that we were excited about. Now, all these numbers on the whole are slightly lower because we decided instead of our exams averaging out the 85 to 87% range, we wanted them to average in the 80 to 82% range. But we assumed that when we lowered the averages by making the exam slightly more difficult, that they would lower proportionally. But they didn't lower proportionally because some of our changes really did work. We put in a lot of clinical reasoning sessions with our students to really try and help boost this clinical vignette area, and it seemed to be working. Another thing, that the normal and abnormal processes are nearly identical, and in this case where it used to be a 2-to-1 ratio, again, nearly identical in the representation of that content. So that was something we were really excited about. Now, one of the things that we didn't really anticipate very well was how our change for anatomy was going to do things. And I said I talked to you about our gasp moments or our phew moments. Well, we did a lot of happy, relieved sighs when we saw those numbers I was just talking about with normal and abnormal processes and with the question types. But one of the things that made us gasp was, oh, wow, our students were performing terrible anatomy. And anatomy was one of the few subject areas that in our old curriculum was not integrated. Everything else was integrated in our old curriculum except for anatomy. So we integrated anatomy in the new curriculum, and it just wasn't working. And we were able to kind of pull that out quickly because of this data that was available to us through ExamSoft. Well, one of the things we did was we had eliminated in-class lectures that were really more a half hour to guide the students through what they were going to do in dissection lab and give them some information and some overview, help them tie it to what the rest they were learning. We wanted to put in just as much lab time as we could to really help them dig into that, so we eliminated those and made it lab time. Well, what we found was, no, the students really still needed that guidance, and they weren't ready to be self-directed when it came to their approach to anatomy. So we went back and we added those back into future blocks. And once we added those back into future blocks, our anatomy performance came back up to where we intended it to be. But that's an example of something where, had we not caught it through this category data now, we would have had to wait 2 years, almost 2.5, 3 years, until our students got through Med 1-2, went and took the boards, we got the board results back, and then they finally send us the summary performance of our students in each of the categories, and we would have seen, oh shoot, our students all tanked anatomy on the boards. well, we were able to account for that much, much sooner and correct for it so that hopefully when they go to take the boards, we're not going to see that problem at all. So with that, I will quit babbling quite so much and give Stephanie a chance to read some of your questions to me. I hope you have some good ones for us. Feel free to toss those in the chat window if you haven't already done so. And with that, Stephanie, if you got some questions, throw them at me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Eric. Let's go ahead and jump into the questions, but just in case you joined us late, if you would like to pose a question to Eric, please look to the GoToWebinar control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. Underneath the Questions tab, go ahead and type in your question, and then I'll read the questions out and have Eric answer them. Okay, let's just jump right into it. First question we have is, many of the things we would want to track would be for internal purposes only, while others we would want to share the performance with our students. Do we have the ability to choose which ones are included on reports and released to students and which ones aren't?
Absolutely. You can definitely customize those things. You can select which categories to show on the reports and to release to students, when you want to release it to students, all of those things. Because you're on the right thought pattern, and that was definitely something we did. We had a lot of things that we categorized in exams that we never had any intention of showing the students, but it was just for us to be a metric of whether the students were succeeding or not, or the curriculum was succeeding or not, or a faculty member was having success or not. And so we definitely didn't release some things and did release others, and you have all those powers within the software.
Great, thank you. Next question is, just to clarify, so an individual question can be mapped to multiple outcomes, such as NCLEX, student learning outcomes, QSEN, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an unlimited number of categorizations. So I know my questions usually have between 8 and 12 categories assigned to them, between learning objectives, subject areas, board areas, question authors, block of the curriculum, question type, general area, all these different things we would tag. And so, yeah, you can definitely tag as many things as you'd like to a question.
Great. And a follow-up question is there a limit to the question pool size?
None that I'm aware of. That's a good question, but we've got clients with 20, 25,000 items in a bank, and we've never had any of them hit any sort of limit that I'm aware of. So no, there's as many as you can put in there, we'll take.
Great, thanks. I've had several attendees ask the question or pose the question or ask for clarification on what you mean when you say a rubric. Could you clarify that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. You know, different schools call them different things. And, you know, in undergrad, they're usually referred to as rubrics. If they're being used for a project or presentation, they're referred to as rubrics. But in medical and nursing schools, it might be a checklist or a rating scale that you're using to rate your students on performance. So, you know, think of it like a grid, and the rows are each thing that you're going to assess the student on. Maybe you're assessing them on their patient safety and their professionalism, their interpersonal communication. Each one of those things would be a row, and on that row there would be a rating scale that you've set as far as your different columns are the rating scale in excellent, very good, good, fair, poor, or whatever scale you want to use, and there's points associated with that. So as you go through and you use the rubric to rate something, you're basically taking a look at what you intended to assess them over, what your scale for rating them is, and then looking at the explanations for each of those ratings to say, okay, does this student deserve the first rating or the second rating or the third rating and so on. And one of the things we do is with that rubric, we will allow you to categorize the different rows of those rubrics to be a part of certain competencies or subject areas, and that will give you the same category data that the multiple choice exams will give you. So it's a different form of assessment, but it'll still give you the same information and data.
Great, and I believe that we have reoccurring demonstrations for the rubrics, our rubric platform. Is that correct, Eric?
Absolutely. Every Tuesday we have demos pretty much all day, and if Tuesdays don't work for you, we can find another day, I'm sure. But you can sign up for them on our website. You can get in touch with some of our different teams, and they can help you with that. You can email me. I can help get you put in touch with one of those. If you're interested in checking out Rubrics, I would really encourage you to attend one of those demos and really see what it can do, because it's a very powerful, powerful tool, and we're really excited to offer it to people. So there are recurring demonstrations going on for that every single week. So if you've ever got a spare 30 minutes, it really is only a 30-minute presentation, much more short-winded than I was today, I promise you. You'll get a lot of great information out of it.
Great, thanks. And if you'd like to contact Eric about that, I believe his email address is up on the screen, or you can email info@examsoft.com. Okay, next question is, you demonstrate longitudinal data for a preclinical curriculum. Any experience with adding years 3 and 4?
We didn't have the longitudinal exam data for 3 and 4. I don't personally have experience with that because we used MBME shelf exams, which pretty much everybody does for their Med 3 students. We did use it for other things in Med 3-4 as far as some of those rubric capabilities, and we have some experience with that, but it really is, it varies with the curriculum and how you intend to use it. Yeah, I am a big fan of using it in Med 3-4 as well, because I think being able to combine that data from Med 1-2 and that data from Med 3-4 to really continue that longitudinal analysis of your students is really powerful.
Great, thank you. Next question is, to clarify, the results that are received for faculty and students by reports, are they for the exam only and not cumulative?
They're both. So you get individual exam reports after every single exam that you can choose to release to your students, and then you can also cumulatively analyze and release reports on cumulative results across time, and you can choose which exams and quizzes and things you want included in that, and choose which ones that you don't want included in that. So it's really up to you when it comes to the cumulative ones. You get a lot of customization there, but you can do both.
Great. Next question is, can the student reports on performance be created without the questions themselves?
Can you say that one again for me?
Yes. Can the student reports on performance be created without the questions themselves? I think that they're asking, are the questions shown on the reports that are given back to students?
Perfect. Thank you for the clarification. Yes, absolutely. Now, you can choose to release the questions if you want to. I advise not, because you want to keep your items safe and keep using them over and over again and build up all that valuable historical data and so on. So yeah, absolutely, you can release the categories and the performance and all the different statistical breakdowns and things without showing the questions in those reports. Absolutely.
Great. Next question is, how did you encourage faculty to fully categorize their item exams? And also, how many people carried out the entire process?
So that varies a little bit. So the way we got them to do it, we had a couple different things. One, I had a very supportive administration who saw the value of this, and they mandated it. One of the things I did even after they mandated it, though, was I went to an area of the curriculum that was particularly struggling. I proposed it to them first and got them on board. And this was an area where it was a great educator who was constantly revamping his part of the curriculum, trying to make it better, and was just failing every time. And the students were always doing the worst in his subject on the boards. So I went to him, and rather than have him revamp his entire thing, I said, put these categories in place, do the categorization, let's look at the data, and we'll go from there. And so we looked at that data. Over the next year, we made some changes. We made targeted changes, though, based on that information. And then within 2 years, the students who were the first group that went through his new block based on the targeted changes went from the lowest scoring subject area on the boards to, when those students took the boards, they were the third highest scoring area. And so I intentionally started with them, even though I had the kind of mandate from above that everybody had to do it no matter what, because then once I was able to show that to some of the other block areas, they were really into it as well, and they didn't fight me as hard. The other thing is, my last few holdouts who were the slowest to do it or would do it but wouldn't get it done for the students right after the exam, they'd do it a couple weeks later. Well, the students got so interested in these reports and really loved them, and they were such great help for them in their education that if they didn't get a report, they were mad. They were really upset, and they would go to the professor's office and demand these things and say, hey, every other block of the curriculum gives this to us. Why haven't you given this to us? I need these reports. I need this information. I'm trying to study for the boards. How am I supposed to do that if there's a hole in the information? I need this. And they would put the pressure on the faculty for me. And the next day, all of a sudden, there'd be an exam slid under my door with a bunch of categories written on there and pencil and pen and coffee stains all over because they stayed up half the night categorizing once the students gave them a hard time. And so kind of a multiple different angles. The students helped generate some of the force, the faculty have generated some of the force, and the faculty were just interested in doing it somewhat as well.
Great, thank you. And kind of a related question, who assures that the categorization of questions is correct? The faculty could easily miscategorize the questions or put them in different competencies.
It depends. We had a test item review program, which consisted of a group of faculty who were really, really good at assessment and really knew what they were doing when it came to these things. And they reviewed every single quiz and exam before it went to the students to make sure it was content appropriate, make sure it was format appropriate, and also to make sure that the categorization was correct. Not every school has one of those, but the bright side of it is all the category stuff is retroactive. So if they were to categorize everything wrong, it doesn't matter because you can go back and fix it later, and it will automatically repopulate through the entire system with the new correct categorization. The data is retroactive. So even if you give an exam and you don't categorize at all, but then 2 weeks later your faculty member finally has time to do it, if they go back and categorize, you'll still get the category reports and the information from the administration of that exam, even if it wasn't categorized when the exam was given. So if it's a handful of wrong, you'll have the ability to go back and fix it if you need to as it gets recognized over time. Some people put in, like I did, different security steps to make sure that it's done. And then the other part of it is that, I found that sometimes just getting it categorized was a great first step. And then when the reports were being reviewed by the administration and they were like, this doesn't make sense and that doesn't make sense, that would create some of the pressure back as well to get those things done.
Perfect, thank you. I believe this is going to be the last question that we're going to have time for, but just again, to reiterate, if you do have any questions that you would like to pose to either ExamSoft in general or Eric, you can email him at ermie@examsoft.com, or ExamSoft general email address is info@examsoft.com. Last question that we're going to have time for today is how well does ExamSoft integrate with specific course management systems, for example, with Desire to Learn or Blackboard?
It depends. We are doing our best to try and kind of reach out to everybody and integrate as best we can, but there are just certain things, the way they're set up, it works better for and works worse. With Blackboard, we've got a great integration. We can use Blackboard to sync your courses and your students over into ExamSoft, so your course and roster setup would just mirror itself from Blackboard over to ExamSoft without any setup on your part, as well as when you get the grades in ExamSoft, you get all those scores done, you could push them back straight into the Blackboard gradebook so that you wouldn't have to do any of those steps manually. Now with some of the other ones, it'll depend. We can do different parts of that. We can do single sign-on. We can do LTI and LDAP integration. But it really depends on how you've got it set up, because even with Blackboard, if you're using certain types of authentication, it won't work as well versus others. It's really a customizable thing. So one of the things we like to do is, if you're interested in that, we're happy to work with you on it. You kind of give us, and how is yours set up? How does yours work? We'll kind of compare that to the way ours would interact with it, and we'll give you the best case scenario. Here's what we can do. These are the parts we can integrate. These are the parts we can't integrate, because it's hard to give a blanket sweeping answer on, because every setup is so different that we want to make sure that we're customizing, our answer to the particular client.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric, for your presentation this afternoon. It was very informative. We want to thank everybody who took time out of their busy schedule this afternoon to participate in the conversation and listen to the presentation as well. Again, just one more time as a heads up, we have recorded the webinar. We will be sending out a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck to everybody who attended and actually registered for today's presentation. So you should be getting that by the end of the week. Keep a lookout for that. We want to thank you once again and hope everybody has a really great afternoon. Thank you.